And without further ado, I'm going to welcome Caroline Edwards from the Centre for Contemporary Literature here at Birkbeck to do a little intro before handing over to Jaspreet to do her 3 readings. Caroline?
Hi everybody, thank you Ben. Really delighted to have you all with us tonight. We're so excited to be welcoming back Jaspreet Kaur, who's currently our writer in residence in the politics department at Birkbeck. So Jaspreet is perhaps better known for her poetry under the name of Behind the Netra. She's an award-winning spoken word artist and writer from East London, and also an educator who spent 5 years teaching history, sociology and politics in secondary schools across London. Jaspreet has an academic background in history and gender studies and a passion for social justice. And she's been committed to using her writing and spoken word to tackle gender discrimination, mental health stigma, the post-colonial immigrant experience, and taboo issues within the South Asian community. She's got a very impressive CV. The last 3 years, she's been performing at all kinds of events, including at Westminster Abbey, the Theatre Royal in London, Cambridge and Oxford University, London City Hall, the House of Lords, Trafalgar Square and Wembley Stadium. And her TEDx London talk, How Poetry Saved My Life, was received by an audience of 1,200 people and talked about how the power of words gave Jaspreet the confidence to overcome her own mental health struggles. And you may have seen her perhaps as a regular guest on things like BBC One's Sunday Morning Live, Radio 4, and she's also been featured in Stylist magazine and the Metro. It's a special day for us and for Jaspreet, as the cover of the new book Brown Girl Like Me, that will be coming out in February, was just released across all of her media platforms today. So really timely and very exciting for us. We're going to be focusing on this text tonight. It's an inspiring memoir-manifesto that challenges existing portrayals of young South Asian women in the UK. And Jaspreet gives us a millennial perspective on how brown women can navigate and balance the intersectionality of their new identities in the political climate, particularly looking at things like digital media, literacy and education. Okay, so the format for tonight then is that Jaspreet is going to treat us to 3 readings, extracts from Brown Girl Like Me, and then Ben and I will be putting some questions to her. And towards the end of the session, we will open up to questions from you guys in the audience. So please feel free to type as we go along anything, and we can pick them up later. And if you'd like to turn on your mic and camera at the end, you can talk directly to Jaspreet yourselves. So Jaspreet, if you're ready, I'll turn off our slide share. There she is. Very warm welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Ben. Such a lovely introduction, and such an exciting day as well. So Caroline's mentioned that today was the cover reveal and the pre-order has now gone out to the world, so it feels like we're really celebrating the book a lot tonight. So I'm really glad everyone can be here and sharing their Friday evening with us, and I'm getting to share a little bit of the book tonight. So I'm going to be starting off with, it's going to be chapter 2 of the book, and it is entitled Beyond the Classroom, Asian Girls and Education. And I thought this would be a really great place to start having a look at and considering some of the stereotypes that we see in the classroom for South Asian girls and how they're treated within schools. This particular chapter has a look at our current curriculum and our education system and how that may be impacting ethnic minorities and specifically brown girls. This chapter also looks at a little bit to do with policies within school and some of the changes that we may want to see there, but also a dive into books, reading and literature, which is why lots of us are here tonight. So I wanted to share that particular section with you all today, looking at the world of books. When I think about the short stories I used to write as a child. My characters would always be white. Hannah and Sarah used to be my go-to names. I'm not quite sure why. They had blonde hair and blue eyes, and they ate English food. It was the only story I knew how to tell because it was the only story that I saw. In the words of award-winning Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, author of We Should All Be Feminists, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. That's why Sheila, who I mentioned earlier in the chapter, wanted to make sure that her books, How to Be an Astronaut and Space on Earth, were illustrated with child of colour on the cover. The issue runs deeper when we look at the writers behind the books. In the 2019 Book Trust report, Dr. Melanie Ramdarshan-Bold found that in 2017, only 5.6% of published authors and illustrators in the UK were people of colour, and of that, only 1.98% were British born. And that between the years of 2007 and 2017, white children's book creators had around twice as many books published compared to those of colour. These writers have also talked about feeling pigeonholed, and that there's difficulties in simply being creators without having to talk about their ethnicity or issues relating to it within or outside of their books. Sadly, like most industries, publishing is a market-driven industry. If books by writers of colour or with characters of colour aren't selling, then publishers can suggest that there's no need for them. So get out there and buy books by Black and brown authors. Find the books with characters of colour. Buy 5 copies or 10. Talk about them, write about them, and give them to all the children you know. Reading is a fundamental part of any childhood, not only intellectually to support literacy skills, but also emotionally as a way to develop cognitive thinking. Seeing, or should I say, reading about characters that are like you can make a massive impact on a child's self-esteem and even deepen their love for reading. And for young white readers, it would also encourage a sense of cultural understanding and empathy for others. But this was never the case when I was growing up, and still isn't. The Centre for Literacy in Primary Education found that only 7% of children's books published in Britain in 2018 had a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic character, despite the fact that this exact demographic makes up a third of school-aged children. When these characters do appear, they are very rarely the protagonist, often only a sidekick or characterized purely by their ethnicity. I was in the supermarket the other day and saw a little girl sitting in her pram, engrossed in what looked like a very exciting book. I felt bad for being surprised, but it was just so rare to see young people reading in public these days. However, the National Literacy Trust Annual Literacy Survey found that during lockdowns in 2020, young people's enjoyment of reading increased. Children found joy and calm in reading during a time of boredom, confusion, and anxiety. Reading and learning can also be another opportunity to give your child choices. My dad would inspire me to read history and culture, fiction and adventure, science and numbers, authors from all around the world, names that sounded a little like mine, because authors themselves can be extraordinary people in the minds of young people. Simon Mears spoke to me about the benefits of surrounding your child with positive role models in books, as well as on screen and in person. She said, at some point, your child would realize they are brown and will have questions. Introverted children might not say it out loud, but they will show it when they meet someone who looks like them or find them in a storybook with illustrations that they can relate to. My eldest started mentioning these things in nursery. I did not expect the questions to come that early. At 7, I can see he likes seeing brown men in books and on TV, and I think it's his way of seeing where he fits in the world. So let's fill our homes with books, art, and knowledge that help them see their place in the world. I shared this sentiment in a tweet once. It said, "When we have kids someday, I'm going to feel honoured to raise them in a home full of love for literature and the arts, with books by brown authors on every shelf and artwork by brown artists on every wall. I'll share the pleasure of reading and learning in my home in all forms. We'll go to the library, I'll give them space and quiet in the day to read, and we'll take a book or 3 with us wherever we go." In my interview with Rupinder Kaur, founder of the Asian Women Mean Business and mum of 2, something she said really stood out to me. She said, "I encourage them, her children, to question everything. If I don't know the answer, we will seek it out together. This environment of reading, learning, and growing as individuals and as a family is truly beautiful."
Thank you, Jaspreet. That was really great. I was going to take the first question, if that's okay.
Sure.
What I was struck by as I was reading the extract was this sense, looking around at how deep and pervasive some of the stereotypes that we see are around us on television, in books. I mean, when I was young, but even now. And my question to you was really, how do you feel as an activist the best way to challenge these stereotypes are? Are we talking about kind of exposing them, or are we talking about creating stronger alternatives, as it were? What do you think is the best way to sort of tackle this, and how do you do it on a kind of everyday basis?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think we do need to expose these narratives and expose why these stereotypes are going on, or where they have been created from, because I think there's an importance there of, specifically for us as South Asian women, to understand why do people view us in these certain ways. And particularly in this chapter on education and the classroom, and what I've seen over the years as an educator is that South Asian girls had been stereotyped as passive students, as docile students, as quiet students, and even had been quoted not the ideal student compared to some of their counterparts, perhaps might be white male students or other demographics who are more seen as ideal students. So we do need to expose those stereotypes and see where are these narratives coming from. And it is because we've seen these tropes about South Asian women time and time again, that we are passive, quiet, docile, and lack autonomy in our lives. And once we've exposed that, once we have shown that those stereotypes exist and where they may originate from, and I touch on some of those themes in the book about where these themes come from, and that goes back into looking at perhaps the colonial period and understanding how Asian women were looked at during that time, during periods of the empire, and how that's now translated here in the West, unpacking some of that history. And then going forward, what do we do next? How do we challenge this? And how do we share our perspective and share our voice? And obviously the book is one way of my attempt to do that, to share our voice, to share our narrative, and to say, we are brown women, and this is us sharing who we are and challenging lots of those tropes and narratives. So literature and books could be one way, but I think there's a number of different ways that we can do that in a number of different industries, not only in literature and the creative arts, which are some of the fields that I work in, but also in science and technology, also in business and law, also in all these multitude of different fields. And something that I do mention in the book is that we as a South Asian community, we love encouraging our children to go into medicine, become a doctor, dentist, lawyer, accountant, and we see a predominant amount of South Asian faces in those particular fields. And don't get me wrong, that's incredible. These fields are very challenging to get into, and we need to be in those spaces. But we need to be encouraging young South Asian children to also go into these other fields as well, so that we can have our voice and our space there too. Because if we don't, we are going to continue to see that our story and our narrative is being told for us, and it's going to be told by other people, predominantly from a white voice that satisfies a white gaze. And I've seen a little bit of that earlier this year. I was working on a short film for a children's TV channel, and they asked me to come on particularly as a writer for that script, because they had seen a lot of that going on before, that when they were telling South Asian stories and it was perhaps written by a white writer, they may have not considered some of the cultural contexts, some of the nuance that might be involved, and were using kind of existing narratives and tropes to tell a story. So this is what we need to see. This is what we need. We need that exposure to challenge it and say, okay, this is what's been going on for far too long, but now this is what we need to do to challenge it. And that's what the South Asian community particularly can be doing by getting into these different fields and sharing our voice. But I don't think all the labour should be on us, and I don't feel all that work should be put onto us to do all of this challenging. I do feel our white counterparts and our white allies need to see how they can support us through this as well. And those in particular positions of power or positions of privilege need to be assessing how can they be doing better, how can they be doing more to support not only the Asian community but other ethnic minorities and the Black community as well. So yeah, I wouldn't want to say that all that labour should be on us. Those in positions of power, those in positions of privilege should be doing something too. So yeah, a mixture of both, a bit of that challenging and exposure, but then some action needs to happen too.
Fab. Thank you, Jaspreet. It's just really rousing to hear you. You're so articulate, and there's such passion and intent behind everything you say, and such experience too. And my question was, you've had a really fascinating kind of journey up to the point of, you know, being about to release this book. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more with reference to the chapter we've just heard on literacy and reading. How did you go about researching it? Did your work as an educator and also, you know, a campaigner and activist within social justice movements intersect with your academic studies when you were writing this chapter?
Yeah, no, really great question. I guess for this particular chapter on education and going beyond the classroom, I think the trigger moment was actually much earlier on, and I think some of the things that inspired me to write this particular chapter were my own experiences in school and at university. I remember not only being a student that was very introverted, shy, and didn't have much confidence, even thought of speaking in front of audiences now, if you told my 13-year-old self that, she would have been absolutely terrified. That would have never happened. But I was that student that would never put their hand up in class, and I would be terrified of debates. I would be terrified of public speaking, and that changed over time because of one teacher. I do mention her in the acknowledgements at the end of the book. Her name was Miss McCarthy. She was my sociology teacher, and she was the one teacher who really helped me develop that sense of self-confidence and self-belief. And I remember one day she sat me down after a lesson and said that, Jaspreet, you are made to do great things. You just need to have that self-belief in yourself. And that one conversation really did change a lot in my life. But I remember the years prior to that, I was that brown girl at the back of the class that wouldn't say a word. And then I remember developing a little bit of confidence when I got into my A-levels. I did start putting myself forward for positions. I became head girl and those sorts of things, and kind of started developing a lot of that confidence. But then I got knocked back down when I went into the world of university, and it was kind of in that initial first year of overhearing a conversation from a lecturer and another teacher, and I overheard a conversation about their thoughts on South Asian girls being students that would just have to get married after they leave university. So there was no point in encouraging their self-aspirations. And I remember overhearing that conversation and that assumption that as soon as we leave uni, we're all going to get married. And that really did knock me back again. And all of these little moments from my own experiences, and then what I saw as an educator then when I became a teacher and was teaching in schools here in London, and seeing this still happening 10 years later, that South Asian girls are still the quietest in the class, are still not putting their hands up, are still not feeling that sense of self-belief and self-confidence. I was like, we need to be doing something about that. Why is this going on? Because academically, South Asian girls are the second highest achieving in the country. We're followed closely behind Chinese boys and girls, and the next demographic is South Asian girls. So it's not that we're not smart. It's not that we're academically not doing well. We're getting the grades. Why is that not translating elsewhere? And why is that not being reflected in wider institutions? And why is that not changing people's perceptions of South Asian women? And that's what made me want to write this chapter, kind of looking at my own personal experiences and that what I saw in schools. And then hand in hand with that, the activism work that I've been doing over the last few years, the mentoring work that I do. There's a particular network for mentoring that I work quite closely with. They're called the Girls Network, where they match up mentors, women in a number of different industries that are excelling in their careers, and they match them up with a 16 to 18-year-old female student, usually from quite deprived areas of the UK or quite disadvantaged backgrounds, and I'm a part of that program. And when I was supporting some of the girls there that I mentor, it was still a lot of that I was seeing, that kind of lack of self-belief, that lack of self-confidence, and no one telling them that they should be believing in it themselves. So what this chapter then made me do was think about, okay, how can we be doing this in lots of different ways so that we can empower young South Asian girls in schools, and then further on in later on in their education as well, how can we be empowering them? And there's a number of different ways that I'm suggesting that: books, literacy, curriculum, policies, mentoring, and all these different aspects. But I did a thorough literature review on all of this before I got stuck into the chapter, and there was very little on South Asian girls. There were a few other ethnic minority demographics that have had a lot of research done in the last 2 decades, but there was very little on South Asian girls. So I was starting from scratch a little bit. And then there was the interview process. So interviewing girls as young as 16 about their experiences in schools, and what they would like to see us do better for them as adults and as educators, but also speaking to South Asian women already in the education space. So I spoke to some of the South Asian head teachers that we have here in the UK, as well as educators in the university field and in further education, and getting their perspectives and understandings as well, and kind of combining that with some of the younger thoughts too. And there was lots of similarities. There was a few differences, a few places that there's a few disagreements, but overall there's quite a few similarities in what the educators were seeing, and then what these young people were feeling, and what they wanted to change to. So that was kind of the approach, but I think it started from thinking about my own personal experiences, and also seeing that as a teacher it was still going on today.
And the fact that you include the section about speculating on if and when you might have your own children, I mean, it's a very kind of holistic perspective. Things need to change at all levels and at all ages, don't they? And that sort of leads us quite neatly into the next extract that you're going to read to us on the theme of parenthood and raising a brown feminist.
Absolutely. So this is a chapter that is actually later on in the book. So it is chapter 8. It's entitled "Mum's the Word, Parenthood and Raising a Brown Feminist." And this particular one actually starts off with a little insight into my research thesis that I did when I was doing my master's in gender studies at UCL. So it starts off giving a little insight into what that particular thesis was about. And I thought I'd give a little trigger warning, because it is quite heavy topic. We are going to be talking about gender-based violence at the start of this chapter. So I thought I'd just give a bit of that disclaimer. It's a girl. For years, I wondered why these three simple words have such power to terrify parents, shatter communities, and even shake up entire countries. My anger and confusion led me to write a whole thesis on it for my postgraduate degree in gender studies. But it also led me to one of the most heartbreaking stories that my granddad ever told me. The story I'm about to tell you might come as a shock for some, but for others, it will reaffirm everything we already know and feel about violence towards women and girls. We were sitting in our living room one evening. Babaji was reading the most recent copy of Des Perdes newspaper while still managing to have one ear on the radio. Me reading books on post-colonial theories on gender, you know, just some light reading. He asked me what I was studying so intently, and I began to tell him about my research on female infanticide in Punjab. He seemed sincerely interested. Then suddenly he went quiet and still, as if he had frozen in his seat. Babaji was so often the life of the party and the loudest voice in the room, so this wasn't normal. I saw his eyes drift off into the distance. I could tell from the expression on his face that his mind had gone somewhere dark. After a few moments of silence, he began to tell me the story of one of his elder relatives who had two daughters, aged 5 and 7. One day, the father woke the two daughters and told them to get dressed in their best clothes and get ready to leave. He was going to take them on a trip to Gondwal Gurdwara, a Gurdwara well known in Punjab for its bolli, a stepwell, paved with 84 steps. With pure excitement, the two girls quickly got ready and they set off on their journey. After some time walking, they eventually reached a long dirt road alongside a river. Hand in hand, the two girls happily skipped down the road. Suddenly, and without hesitation, the father pushed the two girls into the river. Neither of them was able to swim, and they both drowned. The father continued on to the Gurdwara, sat there and relaxed as if nothing had happened. When he returned home later that day, he said to the family, the deed was done. Babaji paused at this point. He looked at my face, my eyes filled with tears. Are you sure you want to hear any more? He asked. Yes, I replied hesitantly. He then gave me another example of a Hindu family from a nearby village. A woman had been pregnant and the family waited anxiously for the birth. The child was born, and with the realization that it was a baby girl, Babaji told me that the mother suffocated the baby to death. They then dug a ditch at the back of their farm and stuffed her body in. Soon afterwards, dogs dug out the body and consumed it. I ran out of the living room and into the bathroom, retching over the sink. I couldn't hear anymore. Researching theories, policies, and interventions about gender-based violence was one thing, but hearing these stories firsthand shook me to my core. And it was all down to sun preference, in gender inequality. Because apart from anything else, sons are seen to provide financial support for their families in the future, as well as continuing the family name, whereas daughters are the ultimate economic burden. According to the UN Population Fund, as of June 2020, there are 140 million girls around the world that are considered missing. Take a minute to pause on that number. that is twice the size of the UK population. My academic research, these stories, and the time I spent at the unique Home for Girls orphanage near my family's home in Jalandhar, Punjab, acted as the catalyst for much of my feminist activism and informed what I still fight for today. This issue of son preference is not a faraway problem. It sits in our homes in the diaspora too. Every time we say, let the men eat first, every time we force our daughters to do all the house, the sons sit idly by, every time we hand out boxes of laddu when a son is born, but tell mothers, never mind when a daughter is born. This all builds to the same dangerous mindset that might be eradicated within the next generation. We must reach the moment where we celebrate the life of a daughter in the same way we do a son, starting from the minute they are born. The Pink Laddu project is promoting just that. They've been encouraging families to celebrate the birth of their daughters by distributing pink laddus or other sweet treats to ensure that families are rejoicing in the life of their daughters from the very start. By celebrating our girls from the moment they enter this world, we are giving them and the rest of the world a very important message. They are loved and that they are important. Mum of two, Nasreen Nupur, wrote in Brown Girl magazine that this is precisely why she knew she wanted to name her daughter Aisha, after the Prophet Muhammad's wife. This name was the perfect fit as I started my lifelong journey of empowering my daughter, she said. Bibi Aisha is one of the most extraordinary and prominent female figures in Islamic history. She was courageous, brilliant, and empowering. After the death of Prophet Muhammad, Bibi Aisha's role in politics and serving the public further emphasizes her influential status, she said. Women have been at war politically, socially, and economically for too long. So when I say we ought to be raising all our children as feminists, it means that we will be saving our daughters. It means we'll be saving our sons too, from these toxic masculine expectations. It means teaching our children what equality is and what it should look and feel like. It means believing in their rights to equal opportunities regardless of their gender. It means teaching our children to have respect for others and for themselves. It means learning empathy. It means instilling the confidence to believe in ourselves. I want sons and daughters to be kind and expect kindness to and from every gender. And who wouldn't want that for their children? Patriarchy has been able to continue not only because those in power have means of control, but because we, ordinary folk, also police one another and reinforce these sexist ideals. A quick example is when a father is looking after his own children, that is not babysitting, that is parenting. When Indy, my husband, and I decide to have babies one day, I will gladly assure everyone that our baby gremlin is definitely his. That means the parenting, not babysitting, is also definitely his responsibility. In the words of the late lawyer and jurist Ruth Ginsburg, women will only have true equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation. It is here that I would like to say that although I've written this chapter predominantly to advise and support current brown mums and future brown mums on how to raise a feminist, every piece of advice here is also directed at fathers too. Raising a child the majority of the time is a two-person job. They even say it takes a village. So to all the brown dads and dads-to-be out there, I hope this chapter also shows you how to be the best dad when raising a brown feminist. I'd also like to add that although I'm not a mother yet, I'd like to share what knowledge I've gained from the experience of raising my 4 nephews and niece, from educating hundreds of children in schools and community spaces across the country, and from listening to the moving and thoughtful stories that brown mums have shared with me. Before we begin to discuss the tips and tricks for raising the next generation of brown women, let's first consider what we already know and what we've already established in the book so far. We know marriage is not her only happily ever after. We want her to learn about and love her own body. We've seen the importance of self-education. But what else should we be considering when raising the next generation of brown daughters and sons, for that matter? Is it first important for us to consider the parenting that we grew up with? In chapter 1, we considered what it was like for our parents and grandparents to parent from a place of fear rather than a place of comfort. Let's just say we were not the I love you generation, and that inevitably affected us. But before we ridicule our parents for their parenting choices, maybe we should put ourselves in their shoes. It's okay to sometimes be mad at your parents, but we can also feel empathy for them at the same time. As children of immigrants, our parents rarely lived with ease. Instead, overproduction, perfection, and exhaustion became the currency by which they purchased a livelihood in a country that never claimed them as kin, writes Asian for Mental Health on Instagram. Now we must protect our children from paying the same price. Amandeep Sumal, a cognitive behavior psychotherapist and mummy of one, told me that she felt that mothers often think about whether they are able to protect their children from psychological difficulties and to stop the cycles of intergenerational abuse and trauma within their own generation. They come to me in therapy wishing only that their children don't ever feel or experience what they do. Our parents may have been strict with us, they may have been unaffectionate at times, they may have even treated us unjustly, but we need to let go of the resentment and pain. Remember, you don't need to hold any more space for it. Take some time to unpack your own baby bag from your childhood. See what lessons from your parents worked and what didn't, and only repack the helpful bits in your new child's kit. Simon Mia, journalist, author, and writer and mum of 3, has been trying to find that balance. She told me, I want my children to feel able to express their emotions. I was raised to always be stoic, and this was presented as strength. I absolutely do not want my children to inherit that. On the positive side, I was raised with a wonderful sense of family, generosity, and I was steeped in spirituality. I'd love to pass these on to all my children. This is a beautiful example of how we can let go of the wounds, but still hold on to the parts of our culture and identity that brings us joy. As we become the next wave of brown mothers raising brown children, it is possible to raise brown feminists, both girls and boys, without entirely rejecting our own culture and fitting into what Western feminist standards dictate. I assure you there is plenty of useful knowledge to be found steeped in ancient traditions, home truths and old remedies, like turmeric and ginger will save you from everything. Seriously though, when raising the next generation of brown women, the outright dismissal of our traditions is not the solution. We can understand our parents' context, learn useful lessons from them, heal, show compassion, and move forward so we can do better for our kids. Our parents' and grandparents' jobs were to make sure we survived. It's now our job to make sure that we thrive. According to the Good Childhood Report 2020, research carried out by the Children's Society on young people's well-being and happiness found that for both boys and girls, their highest mean happiness score was associated with their family, followed by friends, school, appearance, and schoolwork. This shows that the happiest place in the world for children to be is with us, their family. That's why it's so important we do the best we can for them.
Oh, thank you, Jaspreet. Yeah, so I mean, as you mentioned in your trigger warning, the histories of female infanticide that frame the beginning of this chapter are so viscerally brutal and searing and violent. But I wanted to ask you a question actually that followed on from that history, and you focused towards the end of that reading in the intergenerational connections. I was really struck by the interview material you included from Saima talking about how she was raised to be stoic and to kind of always show strength, and she doesn't want her children to inherit that. Um, so, I mean, I guess I wanted to ask, how do you see contemporary brown feminism moving from that struggle? You talk about it as survival, that your parents and grandparents' generation just had to survive and endure in very difficult circumstances. And how can you move from that survival towards a kind of flourishing, for want of a better word? You describe it as making sure that we thrive.
And I guess unpacking that intergenerational trauma, which it was just a topic that comes up a lot these days. We're seeing it a lot on social media. I think understanding what intergenerational trauma is kind of the place to start. And there's been lots of research on intergenerational trauma, specifically for the Black community, with histories of atrocities and oppression and slavery. There's been studies since the 50s, particularly for the Jewish community and those that were survivors of the Holocaust, and how, in fact, for those particular communities, there was evidence to prove that the trauma that those survivors had gone through had actually passed on to their children and to even their grandchildren. And there was lots of scientific evidence over the years to look into this. And it was actually showing that our DNA code actually changes and alters when we have suffered from trauma. So it actually literally gets passed on in our DNA and literally gets passed on from parent to child. And the only way that we can undo that, this trauma that seems to be passing on from generation to generation, is if we take a moment to stop and recognize that this is going on. And sadly for our generation, for millennial, the kind of millennial generation, the Gen Z generation, we do have to take a moment to stop and pause and recognize that this is all going on, and seeing that maybe that our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation were suffering from a number of different traumas. And if you think specifically for the South Asian community, in the last 50 years, we've had everything from genocide to partition, to then migration and the oppression that we may have faced through there. And now even a pandemic. And if we think about all those things that our parents had gone through and how that is then reflected in society, the way that it actually looks and the way that it translates is stuff like the problem with alcoholism in the South Asian community, forms of addiction, forms of violence and abuse. And these are the ways that that trauma is being translated. It's not as obvious as perhaps some other mental health signs of saying, okay, this is depression, this is anxiety, this is PTSD. It may be kind of showing itself in different ways. So I think there's kind of a part to understand there. But now going forward and for future generations, as well as our parents and grandparents' generations, those that do want to heal, is now finding that sense of healing, and what does that look like? And that's a really challenging question, because for each person they'll look like something completely different. But some of the tips that I've suggested in the book is really looking into our well-being, understanding our mental health. And I know the statistics go around that 1 in 3 people suffer from mental health, or 1 in 3 people in mental health issues, but mental health is a 1 in 1 issue. It's not, I don't believe it's a 1 in 3 issue. I think each and every single one of us, we have mental health. And if we start to consider that in the same way that we look at our physical health, and we're willing to spend time and money on our physical health and the food we eat and a £500 gym subscription, then maybe we should be looking at our mental health in that same way, and looking at tools and mechanisms to support our mental health so that we can heal, and so that that doesn't pass on to future generations. And There's the kind of more formal services, but like looking at kind of mental health services here, specifically in the UK, and looking for forms of therapy. But there has been lots of struggles there in terms of not receiving culturally sensitive mental health, and obviously the delays in getting that mental health support or the adequate right amount of mental health support. But also looking at kind of other techniques as well, other tools as well, thinking about creative arts, thinking about writing, which is obviously something that definitely helped me during my years of suffering from depression and anxiety attacks. Creative expression was my outlet, and as a way to navigate all of that, as well as more formal forms of therapy. But there are also other ways as well to consider how we can be supporting our well-being, and sometimes that might be even leaning into old traditions. And this is something that I reflect on in the book, with this whole kind of self-care movement that we've been seeing a lot of in the last 18 months, especially because of the pandemic. And I am a supporter of that movement, but there's some areas there that I find quite interesting, specifically as a brown woman, that seeing things like meditation from a Western perspective has been quite interesting, because for South Asians and most South Asian cultures, meditation has been something that's been a part of our culture since the Vedic century, so for thousands of years. So maybe leading into some of these traditions and things that are part of who we are already may actually help us heal and actually bring parts of those things back. And I do touch on faith and spirituality in the book as well. Not that I know that faith is not for everyone in terms of the traditional sense, but maybe considering where spirituality fits into their lives and what that looks like for them. And some of the women that I've interviewed have reflected on that from a number of different faiths, Muslim women, Sikh women, Hindu women, Buddhist women. And how those women have maybe leaned into spirituality and faith as a way to support their well-being. So there's a number of different things that I've suggested through the book, but I do believe we are the generation of healing. And I know that sounds quite heavy, and that sounds like quite a big responsibility to put on our shoulders. But I do feel that before we do pass on a lot of this pain to our children, or if we already have had our children, there are quite a lot of things to unpack, so that we can make sure that our children do live happier, healthier, and more joyous lives, and that they do thrive and not just have to survive.
Thanks, Jaspreet. Actually, my question kind of runs straight on from that. I think the story you told obviously was extremely shocking, and obviously teaching politics is a profession, and also as a human being, you sometimes feel this kind of sense of fatalism, like there's things that happen that you can't stop, and you feel like there's nothing you can do and you're powerless. And one of the things that I really like about this book and really like about what you're saying is your sense of, for want of a better word, political optimism. And I just wanted to ask how you maintain that sense of optimism and positivity about things.
Yeah, I do say it in the book that I'm an optimist and I'm a realist, and I feel like we as South Asian women need to hold a sense of that optimism, especially as we see in the book, that there's so many different challenges that we're facing in the home, in the private sphere, in the public sphere. So it is sometimes hard to have that sense of optimism, and I've been feeling that has been even challenged within these last couple of weeks. Obviously, with all the news that we're seeing at this current moment, everything with Sarah Everard, Sabina Nessa, who's a South Asian girl that was murdered this month or last month in September, and seeing these news stories coming out and this violence towards women still happening, there is this sense of, are we going to see change? Is any change actually happening? Why are these things still going on? And obviously I've given stories specifically from Punjab and from India at the start of this chapter, but we can see things on our very doorstep that are happening here. But speaking to the women that I interviewed for this book, and that's girls as young as 15, 16 to women in their 80s and 90s, and hearing their stories and hearing their optimism is what gave me a lot of hope, and what still gives me a lot of hope that the change is happening. It may be slow, it may be a stop-start process, but the change is happening. So I think that's what gives me a sense of optimism. And this younger generation that I work with obviously in the education sector, but also through this work I do in schools and workshops, and through poetry. When I'm working with young people, and when you see their optimism and their enthusiasm and their drive to make change happen, not only in kind of social context and political context, but also in the climate change arena as well, and all these major changes that young people are so passionate about, that gives me a lot of optimism, and that gives me a lot of hope, and there's lessons to be learned from young people and that energy that they have. So I do feel kind of interacting with younger generations, whether that's through mentoring, whether that's through teaching, whether that's through anything that you could do, or it could even be the young people that you have in your families or in your friend circles, and having conversations with them is what I think can also help this change, and also encourage this sense of feeling politically optimistic.
Thanks, Jaspreet. And maybe that's a kind of neat segue, talking about younger generations and also activism, onto your third extract.
Yeah, so this third extract really does bring us into the present day. So it's one of the last chapters of the book, and it looks into identity in digital spaces, online communities, but also some of the dangers of the digital world. So it's why I decided to call this particular chapter Power in the Digital Age: Social Media, Solidarity and Sisterhood. In May 2016, rapper Azealia Banks accused singer-songwriter Zayn Malik of stealing elements of her Chasing Time music video for his own Like I Would visuals. Like most celebrity arguments these days, the dispute took place over Twitter for the whole world to see. The confrontation got ugly, with Banks calling Malik a number of racial and homophobic slurs, who was only a part of One Direction to draw brown attention. Banks then turned to Malik's mother, calling her a dirty refugee who won't be granted asylum. Her insults then returned to Malik when she eventually called him a curry-scented bitch. Now, I'm not here to play morality police on what happened during this Twitter exchange, nor am I here to decide whether Zayn was, in fact, a copycat, or to judge Banks's use of social media over the years, including the videos of her digging up a dead cat. What I am more interested in is what happened in the days which followed. The hashtag #curry-scented-bitch seemed to have gone viral. And no, not because One Direction fans were swooping in to support their boo, but because the young Asian female diaspora across the globe took ownership of the slur. Despite the phrase being directed at a young Asian man, it was perhaps due to the gender aspect of the word bitch that images of young brown women were filling up in feeds of Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. For me, the hashtag reminded me of all the many times I was worried that my school blazer would smell of tarka. But more importantly, how tired I was of carrying the internalized self-hate that had been with me since I was a teenager. A hate that made me hide and deny the beauties of my culture for too long. Curry-scented bitch is just one example amongst many significant moments in the last decade where brown women have used the digital space to explore, examine, and express meanings around their identity. As sociologist Dr. Trishma Mitra Khan suggests, The internet has proved to be instrumental for some women's examination, critique, transgression, and subversion of the integral gender, sociopolitical, and cultural scripts that their lives are increasingly subject to and subject to this by. This chapter will look at the more complicated networks of race, political economy, and power as they play out in the rhetoric and spaces of the internet. Current scholarship still has very little on the relationship between race, gender, and digital communication, except for Lisa Nakamura's work, and more recently, Sophia Noble in Algorithms of Oppression, and those that looked at the impact of the internet on the Arab Spring. But what we will see is how the likes of social media have given marginalized voices which have been muted or ignored for so long, a platform to be heard, to show the world that we will no longer be left invisible. We've already seen how many brown women felt that they grew up in a world complicit in their erasure when it came to their lived experiences. Our voices, our stories, our histories are barely mentioned in the school textbooks, the storybooks, and TV screens. But now the digital world gives us an opportunity to speak out. For many brown women, it is our chance to say, we are here, we exist. No more appropriating, stereotyping, or silencing. No one speaking on our behalf, as we've seen brown men do for us, the white man do for us, and even white feminists. I've had a love-hate relationship with social media over the years. Still, my poetic and spoken word journey under the moniker Behind the Nedra would never have begun without it. It transformed my life. It gave me a way of instantly sharing my story with a global audience. The same goes for other brown women who have become household names. YouTube stars like Lily Singh and Liza Koshy, actresses like Jamila Jamil, social activists like Ash Sakar. When my first poetry performance went viral, little did I know that a new chapter in my life had begun. I could share my words with the world and they could actually make a difference. The reality is that this book may have never have come to life without it. The internet acted as my portfolio of evidence, my diary of work I'd been putting in over the years. I found other inspirational women of colour online fighting against the patriarchy, the systemic forms of oppression, the erasure. I found poets, writers, academics, friends. I didn't have the social capital of powerful allies in influential positions that could get me to the front of the line, on TV screens, or on the top of a publisher's desk. All I had were my words, my keyboard, a decent Wi-Fi connection, a mission, and a dream. I knew that it could be powerful, and that power, my power, kept on growing. Many brown women have noticed that through digital media, they have learnt so much about themselves and their own identity, things that perhaps schools and even their families never gave them. It's connected women to their history and culture, filling in gaps in their knowledge. The digital world has provided space to explore individual identity and meaning and foster collective identity support and networking. For the millennials and the Generation Z brown women, the most popular platforms seem to be Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, whereas for the older demographic, they lean more towards Facebook, as well as independent blogs and websites. We've seen brown women's use of Tumblr fluctuate over the years, as has the use of big names like YouTube, Pinterest, and Snapchat. Oh yeah, and there were also the days of MySpace, which I'm sure we're all eager to forget. These platforms have allowed all marginalized women, whether they are women of color, trans women, or non-binary people, to design their own forms of feminism, sometimes even a transnational feminist vision. And as we ride this fourth wave of feminism, we, brown women, won't be left behind as a footnote. We now have a sense of sisterhood and solidarity, a unique bond that hasn't happened in any other time in human history. But all this power that has arrived with the digital age has come at a price. For a little while, I felt I could express reflections of my brown cultural identity and participate in my activism safely online. I thought because no one could physically hurt me or say anything to my face that I was safe. Unfortunately, I was very, very wrong. What I naively thought a safe and open public sphere for brown women that had catapulted our collective progression was in fact now evolving into a commercialized, private, heavily surveilled and dangerous space. I say dangerous because I mean it. I've received messages in my inbox telling me that I should die, telling me, someone with a history of depression and anxiety, that I should kill myself. Along with a platform on which I could share my voice also came death threats, rape threats, troll attacks, bigotry and misogyny. I would quote some of the messages I've received about what would be done to me if I kept writing about taboo topics, about feminism, about anything really. But the messages are so disgusting that I can't bring myself to even type them here, knowing that my loved ones will read them one day. It would destroy them. It destroyed me for a while. And don't be fooled by my fierce feminist feed. Sometimes the horrible comments, tweets and DMs, they hurt. I remember the first time I received a rape threat online, I was too scared to go back on my laptop for weeks. It reminded me that every time we, as women of colour, find a voice or an ounce of power, there will be someone trying to take it from us again. And I don't want to excuse their behaviour as just trolls. Some of these messages are from the kind of person who lives down your street or sits next to you on the tube. There are people who hate women so much, especially marginalised women who voice their opinions, that they want you to die. It's been enough to force many people of colour to leave the platform entirely. We're left holding a double-edged sword. The same place that gave us empowerment and the freedom to express ourselves is also the same thing that can cut us back down. Women of colour were being mistreated online before they were ever really on it. There have been examples of this since the outset of the internet. As far back as the early 90s, white men in early chat rooms impersonated Asian women to get attention in these new social spaces. This is what Nakamura then coined identity tourism. Fast forward to 2011, when the world learnt that the famous blog Gay Girl in Damascus was not Amina Abdullah Araf at all, but in fact Tom McMaster, a white 40-year-old American living in Scotland. When McMaster was asked what made him think it was okay to appropriate a female queer Arab identity in this way, he said that as a white American man, no one would listen to his views on Arab politics. The irony. Tom basically saw what it was like to be a woman of colour whose opinion is always silenced. He was being denied attention, so he demanded it in a queer, brown woman's online persona. And as the years went on, the examples of online hostility and hate towards women have grown, from the abuse of female Muslim academics received online to the Good Place star Jamila Jamil saying online bullying has even brought her to a point of near death. In Chapter 4, we saw how social media platforms tried to silence Rupi Kaur's visual expressions of menstruation. We've seen how women's bodies are censored left, right and centre, whether it's hair, blood or nipples. In recent years, we've seen the use of Islamophobic and right-wing rhetoric increasing day by day, as well as multitudes of trolls accounts appearing and reappearing every day. Even when it comes to the delivery of the news, only 26% of the people in internet news stories and media news tweets are women, according to the Global Media Monitoring Project. Now imagine how much smaller that percentage is for marginalized women. It just goes to show that the internet doesn't really care about us. Ultimately, we're working in a system that's working against us most of the time. It feels like it was not built for us brown women. These spaces have also become arenas for big money, as social media sites, tech companies' need for advertising and desire for profit grows. There's also all the scary stuff about data mining and cyber snooping and the use of our own personal data as capital, with us having no clue about it. Then there's the kind of behavioral data that can even be used in political campaigning. If Cambridge Analytica showed us anything during the 2016 US presidential campaign and the 2016 Brexit referendum, is that what we think, say, and do online can have a significant impact on society. Every time we click and type and send and swipe, someone is watching. And someone is using that knowledge to make sure that we do more of it, clicking and typing and sending and swiping for someone else's gain. All a bit creepy, I know. So as brown girls, we all have a collective responsibility to try and influence this data where we can by being very careful about the information we do and do not want to give and what we do and do not engage with online.
Thank you, Jaspreet. It's extraordinarily interesting the way that, of course, you use social media in your experience. And actually, what you said there about the double-edged sword is exactly also what the wider narrative is. I remember back before the Arab Spring, even before then, there was this sense that social media in particular and digital technology in general would be a tool of liberation. And now in the wake of Trump and others, we see very much a far darker side, and there's a very pessimistic view of it. So I wanted to ask, based on your experience, what do you think could be done about social media to make it more of the optimism and much less of the pessimism?
I guess specifically in the social media world, there are conversations starting about algorithms that can recognize this kind of behavior, that can recognize homophobic abuse, racist abuse, misogynistic abuse, and can recognize when this is happening online and kind of flag it, block, delete, report where it's needed. So I know there's conversations about that happening. But if we take a step back and actually look at some of these tech companies themselves and some of these social media companies themselves, and see that at the top levels of those companies, and not so much the actual developers and the people working on the ground, those spaces actually have quite a lot of ethnic minority people in them. If we look at the boards and we look at kind of higher up in those spheres and in those specific industries, it's still predominantly white and male. So we're not necessarily having voices at that level saying that there's a problem here on these sites and there's a problem here in these digital spaces. So until there's a radical shift in how these tech companies work and how these social media companies work, I don't think we should be relying too much on them to make those changes for us. I think the best thing that we can be doing as individuals and as communities can be thinking about, okay, how can we be using social media safely? Should we be limiting our social media use? And I know that's been significantly difficult in the last 2 years. Obviously, throughout the pandemic, people were using digital spaces as a way of communicating with one another, as a way of dealing with isolation, as a way of connecting with people, and also using it as forms of entertainment and that sort of stuff as well. But I think now, as we're moving out of that period and moving into this new normal, I think we need to be thinking about how do we now take a lot of those things that we're using the digital space for, and specifically for women of colour who have been using this space to explore their identity as a form of expression, as a way to find sisterhood and solidarity, some of the things I mentioned at the start of the chapter. How can we now be doing those things and moving them into the real world too? And moving these things back perhaps into community spaces, into public spaces, and not relying on the digital world as our only form of expression and activism and solidarity. I think it can be used as a tool in smart ways, and obviously I've reflected on that on the book about the reach that it can have, the way that we can connect with one another or connect with people in positions of power. But I think we need to be considering, okay, how do we take this back into the real world, that this isn't just happening in the digital space, that we need to be seeing change happening in other ways too. And I think there's also another part to consider, that not everyone can access the digital world in the same way as perhaps, as I'm talking about, this millennial and Gen Z generation have. There's also demographics that can't use the digital space in that same way. There are older demographics that don't use these digital platforms like this. There's other people with other specific health needs that can't use these spaces like this. So how do we make sure we're including them in these conversations too? How do we make sure we're including them in our solidarity, sisterhood, activism, all those things that we've been using the space for? So one of the things that I'm encouraging is we go back into community spaces, because there is something very, very special about being in the same room as people that have that same passion as you. And I think there's something really unique and beautiful and really special about being in the same room as people who have the same fight as you, who may have the same worries, concerns as you, or having kind of those face-to-face chats, or venting, or ranting, or whatever you need to do. And I don't think that always translates online. I feel like there's something very special about being face-to-face and in public physical places. So that's what I'm trying to encourage, that we still use the digital space in smart ways and in safe ways, but we start to move back into the real world too. And I kind of end this chapter on something that I love, which is having a cup of tea, having a cup of jar, something very big in most South Asian cultures, whether it's called chai, jar, however you wish to pronounce it. For generations, brown women have been having conversations over cups of tea. And it's something that comes up a lot throughout the book, that a lot of these conversations, oh, have we frozen?
We can still hear you.
Come back. Okay, it's frozen my screen. Come back. A lot of the conversations in the book happened over cups of tea. That's with the older demographic, some of the younger demographic. There seems to be kind of a common theme there. So I'm encouraging South Asian women to go have a cup of tea with other women. So I think that's what I want to see, kind of us using the digital space safely and perhaps a little bit less, and moving back out into the public world safely as well.
Jaspreet, as I'm so glad to hear you say that. As someone who doesn't use platforms like TikTok and Snapchat, I'm part of your older demographic.
Never ending. It's so many.
Reached. So a cup of tea in a real kind of community hall would be amazing. The last question from Ben and myself before we open up, because we've had some great questions coming in from the people present here this evening, was actually to ask, to take you back to something you mentioned in your response after the first reading, when you were talking about solidarity between different communities. And I wanted to ask, particularly in the online sphere maybe, what can other communities do to be good allies to brown feminists?
Oh, amazing question. This is a really, really good question. I think there's two things that we can think about. I think on the one side, there is supporting women of colour in the existing work that they are doing, and really kind of supporting the activism work that they're doing, supporting the stories that they're telling, and supporting kind of some of that existing stuff that's out there. But I think the other thing that allies could be doing is really reflecting on their own positions of power, on their own positions of privilege, and how can they be amplifying some of those voices. Because I think that's where we're going to start to see some change happening, because those in positions of power or privilege can help some of these bigger structural changes happen. It's very nice if we're supporting one another online, but what we really need to see is structural change. What we really need to see is political change. So I think it's moving from this conversation of allyship and now thinking about coalition, and now thinking about, okay, how can we be fighting these fights together rather than individually, or rather than just kind of outwardly supporting some of these groups? How can we now work together and collectively to have more positive social change? And I know there's a few writers already reflecting on this specifically, of looking at now from allyship to coalition, and what does that look like. I think that's what I hope to see, kind of supporting that existing work that's already going on and amplifying those voices, but also thinking about, okay, how can I now take that further with the power and the privilege that I have.
Sorry, Jaspreet, I was just going to jump in with the first question, because actually it leads on very nicely from that. Alexis asked a kind of a similar question, which is, how do we make feminisms become feminism? And I wondered, just putting a slight twist on it, do you have any kind of examples of these coalitions emerging or making a difference anywhere? Is there any groups of working together or coalitions that you'd point to saying that's how it should look, that's how it should be?
Oh, that's a really good question. I can actually give an example of something I've seen quite recently, of something that I think is working particularly well. I'm a part of a program with Operation Black Vote, which is an amazing institution program that's been around for, I think, 25 years now. Lord Simon Woolley started it about 25 years ago. So Operation Black Vote are actually working closely with Oxford University, specifically Magdalen College, at looking at how can we start supporting future leaders from the ethnic minority community. So of course, Operation Black Vote were doing incredible amounts of work beforehand, in their activism work, in highlighting the issues for the Black community and other ethnic minorities. But they are now working alongside Oxford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the country, with lots of power, lots of privilege going around in those walls, and they are working together as a coalition, specifically with Magdalen College, by getting in lecturers, speakers, and lots of people with those kind of really important pieces of experience that they can then teach to these particular leaders from Black and Asian ethnic minority communities. So I've been a part of that program for a year, and a part of that program was a residency at Oxford University, as well as getting a mentor, and a number of different things that they're doing to support us as future leaders. It's called the Pathway to Success program, and I quite like that title because it's kind of like the pathway to success, and what is this journey that we're on, and supporting us on this journey. And there's a number of different people on this program. There's myself, kind of writers, activists, but there's people that want to get into politics, there are people that want to become MPs, there are people that are doing more of the grassroots level work in local communities, and I think that's a nice example of what a coalition could look like. People and places with lots of power, supporting existing programs that are already going on. So that, I think, is quite a nice example.
Thank you so much. We've got, let's take Vanda's question next, because Vanda's just put her hand up, and then I'll come back to Sarah, Shari, and I think we just covered Alexis's question. Vanda, did you want to put your mic on? Hello, Vanda. Maybe that was an accidental hand. Okay, not to worry, we can lay back. Sarah's got a question here saying, I don't know whether Sarah wanted to ask this herself, but
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, here she is. Vanda's back. Thank you.
Oh yeah, hello. Sorry about that. Yeah, it was a couple of things I wanted to say regarding. I mean, it was absolutely fascinating. I haven't read the book yet, but I really enjoyed it. One of the things I wanted to say is I'm old enough to remember the Yorkshire Ripper, and well, not personally, but one of the things I noticed about obviously what's happened now with Sarah Everard and you know the other murder, the other lady was murdered, is yeah, is that at the time of Yorkshire Ripper and even recently looking at a documentary about how it was, what was going on at the time, I think nationally women who were interviewed said, women in Leeds said, you know, well, we have to stay home, we're, you know, frightened, we can't walk the streets. There was a kind of general acceptance. There wasn't the anger that has, you know, this public anger. And so it's taken many years for that to happen. But I do actually think the absolute public outrage of women, it's about time. But I think that is a huge difference, and so it should be. It's a long time ago, but it's taken that long. So that I take sort of encouragement from that, although it's noticeable, obviously, where are the male voices? It seems like women are all, you know. The other thing I wanted to say about the point you made about change and about what other groups of women can do. And one of the things I notice about growing up in this country as a white woman, the class system in this country is very entrenched. And there are so many white working class women who are so marginalized. I mean, if you get out of London and you go to, you know, you don't have to go that far to find people who are living in real deprivation, who do not see themselves in any way as privileged. And indeed, I don't believe they are. That's probably a whole other question about what we do about that. And maybe, I don't know whether that's something that only white people can do something about, but I just think the way privilege, the way the word privilege is used, I just want to say that I don't feel, for me, that just being white, if you're in extremely deprived circumstances and you're educated, I don't think that makes you privileged. It's just the point. It may be obvious, but I feel I have to say it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that point, and I'm glad you brought up the issue of class, because I do think these things intersect. We can't have conversations about race and gender without considering class. So I definitely feel there is a discussion there to be had, but I don't think this is the space for that discussion. I think talking about white working class concerns and issues, there is space for that. I think specifically with the work that I'm doing is to help amplify South Asian women's voices, one that I personally have seen muted for very long. And if I think about kind of my expertise, my knowledge, my experience, that's particularly where my work lies. But that doesn't go to say I wouldn't support other causes, class-related ones for other groups. But I think particularly in this space, even here tonight, I want to amplify specifically the work that I'm doing. But I completely agree that class needs to be mentioned in these conversations, but I don't think this is the particular space to talk about white working class issues.
Jaspreet, if I may come back, because Alexis's question is on a slight tangent to this point, and referring, of course, we've been talking about Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, and even just in the fact that her name is not being mentioned as frequently really highlights the point, doesn't it, that white women get much more media coverage when it comes to domestic abuse and murder victims and so on. Alexis, please jump in if you would prefer to ask the question yourself, if you want to turn your mic on. But if not, I can ask it for you. Alexis writes, there are divisions between women. Oh, here we go. If you wanted to ask it yourself.
Okay. Hi, Jaspreet. Thank you very much for everything you've said. It's been so very interesting. Because I have a perspective too that mirrors some of yours and is different because I'm Black African Caribbean. And sometimes I think, certainly from the background I have, my parents are from Guyana. People from the Indian subcontinent were brought in as indentured labour, and those two factions have been fighting each other ever since, while the white people go back on the sidelines and watch. And I guess the question I first asked was, if I can find it, please bear with me for a second, I'll move fast.
No problem.
What do you think can be done to make feminisms become feminism? Women working together, working in unison to defeat racism, sexism and misogyny. Because it's happening right in front of us. We hear, there is the perspective that you have as an African Caribbean woman. There's the perspective you can have. Then there's the perspective of feminism from a white woman's perspective, and particularly a white middle class woman's perspective. That it's actually quite difficult, and it seems always to end up pitting us against each other, whilst they often then stand back and watch from the sidelines, and then you sort of get the aggrandizing of people like Caitlin Moran, who actually doesn't speak for me at all.
I know. This is something that I've tried to consider in the book a little bit about how can we have this collective form of feminism, because that is what ultimately it was meant to be for. What I hopefully want to see is people considering these different perspectives and considering these different voices and not ignoring them. And I think that's what has been happening for a long time with these different factions, is that we've been ignoring what else is going on around us and what else is going on in the world. And one of the things I suggest in the book is to do a shelf reflection. And what I mean by that is, if you look at your bookshelf, what writers do you see? And what titles do you see? What authors do you see? And if they all seem very similar, then there's a problem going on there, that we're not, perhaps as an individual, considering these different voices, perspectives, and narratives and experiences of other communities. And I'm so tired of seeing these different factions being pitted against each other, and that's happened for women since the start of time, that we are always being pitted against each other. Even today, I received a message saying about my book that, oh, there's been another South Asian woman that's released a similar book earlier this year, as if there can't be more than one South Asian woman releasing a book this year.
Yeah, there is always that, yeah.
It's exhausting, it is exhausting, and I think us as women need to be supporting one another, need to be speaking to one another, need to be hearing one another's experiences, need to be listening. So that's what I'm trying to do on an individual level, and hoping to model that behaviour that I want to see. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your questions very well, but I think that's what we.
It's complex. The issues are complex, and you do factor in class. But actually, where feminism started from was from a white middle class perspective, with lots of contribution from working class white women largely ignored or subsumed, and then we're fighting from we're fighting to get ourselves heard, and that fight has continued, I think, for as long as feminism has been in existence. And I guess
even from the outset. Absolutely, even from the outset. One of the
things you have to start with, I guess you're right, is from an individual's perspective. So I have actually tried incorporating books from other women's perspectives, not just from my own, which I guess is a start, but I think we're a long way from coming together properly. I do.
And just
thank you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you so much. It makes me think of Jaspreet's writing about, how we have to cultivate empathy. And yeah, what a difficult task that is. I wondered if I could loop back to Sarah's question. Sarah, did you want to turn on your mic? raise it yourself, if you're there?
Yes, although I'm sure you would be more. I'll even dare to put my video on hideously. Hi, Jaspreet. Right. It was just that I'm reading F. Hirsch's book, British. You know, different generation from yourself. I'm finding it fascinating as obviously an older white woman. My question was, are the moments when your experiences intersect, or are they just too different? Are you feeling, it was something you said at the beginning of your reading about being other, forgive me if that's the wrong, but not being represented in publishing, finding it really your stories, your experiences being apparently not as important as white experiences, which she makes very, very prominent and very passionate. And I just wondered how you felt about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely a huge fan of Afua Hirsch's work. I have been for quite a long time, and British is actually mentioned in the book as well, in chapter 3 when I'm talking about managing microaggressions. One of the key points that Afua mentions in her book is that very confusing question that we get asked. She calls it the question about where are you from. So I do reflect on that particular one. So there are definitely experiences that intersect, and being women of colour, there are similarities there, but the Black British experience is also very different from the Asian British experience. There are definitely areas of privilege that the Asian community have benefited from that perhaps the Black community have not benefited from, and those are things that I mention in the book as well. Even the sense of anti-Blackness within the South Asian community, I'm calling it out, and the colorism that goes on within the South Asian community there too. So there's definitely themes that intersect with Afua's work and what she is talking about in British, and there's a few things that I have mentioned in this book too. But again, the experiences are different, and every experience is going to be different. The stories are going to be different, and like I mentioned in the answer to the previous question, I think it's important that we do read and hear and listen to these different perspectives to understand a more fuller picture of what Britain looks like today and what Britain has looked like before. So yeah, huge fan of Afua's work, and there is definitely experiences that intersect, but also ones that are very different as well.
Thank you.
As Caroline's just said in the chat, I think I'm conscious that we've had Jaspreet after a very long day speaking with us for more than an hour and a half. So we were maybe going to head to a few of the final questions here. There was, just looking through the chat, there's a few questions remaining. There was one from Rahat about Bollywood. Rahat, would you like to ask a question? Are you still here?
Hello.
Jaspreet, hello, it's Rahat from Barking.
Hi. Rahat and I did an event together a few weeks ago.
You did, yeah, and Barking Dagenham, I'm absolutely in love with Jaspreet, that's all I can say. Jaspreet, I'm going to ask you something a bit different, but really, it'd be really interesting to hear your views on it. So I'm thinking, as we're all talking about literature and so on, and politics and what have you, and then I was thinking about Bollywood, and I was thinking about how does that depict women. And so my question to you is, there's two parts really. It's a bit of a fun question, but it's got a serious undertones as well. So do you feel that Bollywood encourages or discourages the strengthening of women, and even, can we say, feminism? And is it worse or better than the Western film industry? And then how do you compare that to literature? How does that do to strengthen women? So about Bollywood first, and we've all seen, well, most of us seen Bollywood films, and we know exactly how they show women. But what do you think?
Oh, really good question. So Bollywood is it's a really touchy subject, but I'll share my personal experience, because that's all I can say and all I can really reflect on right now quickly, is that I remember growing up, I loved Bollywood, and there's a reason for that. It's because we didn't see South Asian women in many other places, except for the infamous Mira Sial, goodness gracious me, later on Bend It Like Beckham and Gurinder Jadla's work here in the UK. But I remember growing up, Bollywood was the only place I'd see women that looked a little bit like me. So we did watch lots of Bollywood films growing up, and I didn't really recognize what was happening there and how women were being conveyed. As I grew older, I've understood a lot more of that and how misogynistic the Bollywood industry can be. Not only misogynistic and very patriarchal, but also very there's a sense of colorism and anti-blackness going on in the Bollywood community as well. We don't see people with darker skin tones in the Bollywood industry very much. So there's lots of problems going on within that industry. So right now, I'm not the biggest fan of it anymore. However, there are stories coming out now. There are directors and writers, South Asian writers, female writers, that are trying to show more empowering stories and differing voices. And I think, like I mentioned before, this is why we need South Asian young people going into some of these industries so that we can change this narrative, so we can change this story. And I think the Bollywood industry is one place that we can hopefully see that happening, considering it's such a big industry and making so much money and is bigger than the Hollywood industry in terms of revenue and the money it makes. Hopefully that's what we're going to see, more writers, directors, filmmakers trying to convey differing stories that actually empower women and don't just convey women in a tiny outfit surrounded by lots of men dancing around them. It's all, yeah, there's a lot of that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's so influential because Bollywood films are probably, they're getting to every village, every street, everybody, even if they crowd around one TV in the village, and they will watch it and they will be influenced. So it should definitely play its part. Do you think it's any, is it better or worse than Hollywood in terms of writing? I suppose there's a variety in Hollywood films.
Yeah, I would say, from my little knowledge about the Bollywood industry right now, just from kind of an outside perspective, I would say that Hollywood is a little bit better, but we know there's horrific issues going on in that industry as well. And those stories are being highlighted by the Me Too movement and other movements, and women voicing those stories too. So I think any of these industries, when you have people with significant amounts of power and people who use that power on vulnerable people, you're going to see horrible things going on. So I can't say either industry is perfect, but I guess at least in Hollywood, we're starting to see more narratives being conveyed and more diverse stories being conveyed than perhaps Bollywood. So yeah.
And do you think in literature there's more freedom for writers to really share a story and just get their message out there?
Yeah, I guess writing does allow a bit more of that freedom. Obviously, for me personally, I've known that I've felt how writing can give me that voice. But I guess even with these films and these industries, there is always a writer first who writes the script. So it's still a story being told. So I think they kind of go hand in hand, but there's still issues within the writing sphere and the publishing sphere as well. So none of these industries are perfect yet. But for me personally, writing has always been my way of sharing my voice, sharing my story, as well as other stories that have been muted and ignored. So writing is my tool. So I'm gonna keep using that.
So it's good. So these challenges are what makes the heart beat faster, and the more we need to do. But
Yes.
Jaspreet, thank you so much, and I can't wait to see you in person one day.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Jaspreet. I was just going to end with just a couple of reflections, really. I've really enjoyed myself. I'm conscious that we've been talking through a huge number of issues, each of which, in a way, probably merit a seminar, at least on their own. And I think a lot of what we've talked about has been extremely harrowing. There's a lot to reflect on. But I think there's also, and this is the sense that really comes out of your book, that there's a real sense of optimism coming through, in the sense that things can be done. So just to sum up, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Caroline, because this has been, as far as I can think, our first, for a very long time, joint English and politics.
That's right.
Online.
And Jaspreet's work is the perfect bringing together of literacy, reading, education, and contemporary politics. So yeah, thank you so much.
Exactly. And I think what it's taught me is that we need much greater awareness. We need to build coalitions. And perhaps most importantly, and this is a really lovely human thing that comes out of the book, we need to take care of ourselves. And I think I really should say a big thank you to Caroline, a big thank you to everyone who's organised it, a big thank you to everybody who's been asking questions, but most importantly, a big thank you to Jaspreet. Jaspreet, at this point, I normally ask people to recommend books to read, but I think you're more than allowed to just remind us all about the information about your book, where to look for it, when it's coming out, and just give us some details if you can.
Oh yes, definitely. So it is available to pre-order. If you head to browngirllikeme.com, you'll find all the links to all good bookshops on there. It is available at Waterstone, Foyles, Amazon, all the good bookshops. So you can start pre-ordering it now, which is very exciting. But it's officially coming out in February. So 17th of February next spring is when it will be hitting the shelves. So almost there, almost in people's hands. But it's great to be doing events like this where I can be kind of sharing the story a little bit already, so that you guys can get a sense of what this book is about, because it has honestly been 7 years in the making to get to this point. Even today, getting that pre-order link out there, sharing the cover today, it was all very emotional, and I had to take a little walk this afternoon before today's event just to take some time to absorb that. So I think that's what I'll be doing this weekend, just absorbing all of this today. But yes, it's ready to pre-order, and it will be out next February. We're in the process of arranging a big book tour here in the UK, and then hopefully internationally towards the end of 2022.
Wow.
So yeah, very exciting.
It sounds wonderful. Well, we've recorded this talk, so it will be available both, I think, on the English and the politics department blogs and elsewhere, so do keep an eye on it. Thank you so much, Jaspreet. Thank you so much, Caroline. And thank you so much, everybody who's listened in. And Jaspreet, time for you to have a rest this weekend.
Thank you. Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to go do. Make a cup of tea.
Wonderful. Well, that's a good idea for everybody. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jaspreet. And thank you, Caroline. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.